wind, water. This is the Elemental Educator. And now your host, Tyler Comeau.
Thank you for joining our community for another incredible connection. Episodes come out every Monday, so make sure you subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube to stay in the loop. Now get ready to let the alchemy of education ignite your passion for learning. Today's guest is an education powerhouse with over 30 years of experience leading, inspiring, and transforming schools. William D. Parker is the voice behind Principal Matters podcast, the mind behind multiple books, and the founder of Principal Matters, LLC, where he empowers leaders across the globe. He's not only a seasoned principal, but also a sought-after executive coach and consultant. And did we mention he also led the Oklahoma Association of Secondary School Principals? This man lives and breathes school leadership. Get ready for some serious wisdom. And welcome to the Elemental Educator podcast, Will. It is a pleasure to have you here today.
Tyler, I'm so thrilled to be in the room with you. And congratulations on 65 episodes. Thank you for that kind introduction.
It's my pleasure. And, virtual same room. We just figured out we're really far away from each other from where we're both sitting right now. Mm-hmm. But it's the power of this to bring people together and to connect. We're only an hour difference in time, yet thousands of kilometers away. So I'm really excited to just unpack our conversation together. And I want to jump into the big conversation here, which is, how did you get to where you are now?
Wow. It was a long pathway. I grew up in Northwest Tennessee, a very rural community. My dad was a farmer who then became a sailor and then moved us back to the country. And he always worked blue-collar jobs. He was a factory maintenance man. He was a diver for mussel shells in the Kentucky Lake area. And so I grew up on the farm and I grew up in the lakes. When I was in high school, he actually re-enlisted in the Navy. And so we moved to New York and then to Virginia. And so, man, talk about culture shock, going from tiny little rural Tennessee to Long Island and then Norfolk, Virginia. And so when I came back to Tennessee, I had the opportunity to go to university in Oklahoma and majored in English education. And I really thought teaching would be my part-time gig. I just thought, I'll do this for a couple of years out of college, get my feet, get settled, and then move on to something else. And Tyler, like so many teachers, man, I just found it was something I couldn't leave. And not because I wanted to, but because teaching became a calling for me. And I think that's what once you figure out the skills, the relationships, all the systems involved, all the craziness that it takes a while to kind of wrap your mind around, but then you're able to really settle into the joy of teaching and learning. Never was easy, but man, it was so satisfying. And so I did that for 11 years and then stepped into school administration as an assistant principal for 9 years. And then I became a high school principal. And during that time, it was really during my admin years, I really began to miss that part of teaching because I was a language arts teacher. I was also a creative writing teacher. And I used to write with my students. And so there was a point in my school admin years where I was like, I'm hungry to write again. So I started writing about education. I just started writing about what I'm learning as a principal. And that turned into my first book. And then that became my second book. And then now I'm just published my fourth book. And so being able to marry those worlds together just became such a joy and a passion. And all of that led me to the podcast that I'm now doing. I've got over 400 episodes. The work that I'm now doing full-time with Principal Matters, which is really connecting mostly with education leaders across the U.S. and grow academies and masterminds and executive coaching. And then I do a lot of keynote speaking on my books too. But yeah, that's a really short version of the pathway that led me to doing what I'm doing today.
And it's a great version. And I love hearing the stories that everybody shares on how they got to where they are now, because they're so different and they're so unique. And, from people that episode 65 seems like a lot, but episode 400 is huge. And so congratulations on reaching that number and publishing 4 books. One of the interesting things is I think back on the 65 episodes where I've asked people, how did you get to where you are now? And you might be the first person that has said, I wanted to get into it as a part-time gig to start. A lot of people have really cool stories. Some jumped right in, some didn't even want to, and it fell into their lap, but just the uniqueness of these stories. And so I always get surprised to hear how people kind of came into this world of education and then thrived in it and are doing something meaningful with it. And Will, with that, this has got to be rooted in a value that's you're clearly very passionate about, and that's related heavily to our earth element, which is going to actually segue us to our first segment on grounded moments.
3, 2, 1.
Rooted in wisdom, driven by purpose, welcome to Grounded Moments. And to build some momentum here, Will, we are going to play a game. Now, this game is called Principle or Preferences. So I'm going to give you a one-line statement, and without any time to debate, to justify, to give your rationale, you have to state whether it's a principle, a core value to you, something that you think everybody should be taking on, or whether it's a preference, which means it's acceptable for people to not roll with it. Sound good?
It sounds good. This is the most fun I've ever had on a podcast, Tyler. You go.
There we go. So it's totally unrelated to leadership and education, because I was sitting here and going, at the time that people are listening to this, it's going to be midsummer. We're summer theming today's game.
You got it.
Here we go. So first of all, principle, preference, that's it. We'll rapid fire and go through them as quick as we can. Flip-flops are an acceptable footwear for every summer occasion.
Preference.
You should always say yes to a spontaneous road trip.
Principle.
A summer without a bonfire is a summer wasted.
Principle.
People should rinse off before getting in the pool.
Preference.
Every summer day should include something grilled.
Preference.
The beach is always better than the mountains.
Preference. I like the mountains.
I agree. Sunscreen is a non-negotiable, even if it's cloudy.
I'll say principle, or I would be in big trouble with my wife.
Campfires are for storytelling, not phone scrolling.
Principle.
You should never turn down an ice cream run.
Principle.
And hammocks are the superior form of summer seating.
Yes, principle for sure. I've got one in my
There we
backyard.
go. So the whole point of the segment there, Will, and thank you so much for playing, is to start to determine what you value, what we value, but to segue nicely into a deeper conversation around what our core values might be and what they do. And to try to get there a little bit further, I asked you before the show to share a quote that resonates with you. And the one that you brought to the show today is, what you do matters. And I think it's a very powerful statement. So I want to unpack, how did you find it? And why did you choose to share it today?
I'm going to take you back more than 10 years ago, in 2012. I'm a high school assistant principal. I was recognized that year as the state assistant principal of the year, Tyler, which, when you get those kinds of recognitions, it's because your school is performing really well. So on behalf of my school, I got to travel to Washington, D.C., and take my wife and my kids. And they had this huge ceremony where they were honoring assistant principals from every state. And we got to do some professional development together. But one night they had an awards ceremony. So I got to bring my wife and my kids and take photos. But we were there for 3 days. And in the 3 days, I got to really dig deep into relationships with these educators from across the U.S. And I was just sitting in that room one day when I just had this epiphany. And I realized, every educator has so many unsung stories. You're often not only just teaching content and taking kids in places they've never discovered before, but you're also in some cases managing people's trauma. You're dealing with really hard situations, sometimes things you'll never be able to tell anybody because it's so confidential. Literally, you're sitting with families sometimes in the most difficult moments they've ever faced. And I was just sitting in that room, just realizing I am in a room full of, obviously they're being recognized for the work they're doing because they wouldn't be in this room. But across this entire, nation, and let's take it across the world, educators every single day are just showing up and being heroes in ways that most people never recognize. They're unsung heroes. And I was just sitting there thinking, what we do really matters. And sometimes I think at the end of the day, we forget, we might finish a long day. We might be it some school activity. We might have finished whatever that thing is that you're doing. And if you're listening to this in the summer, you're like breathing a sigh of relief that you have some time off. But really, I think it's so important for me at the end of every single day just to take a step back and ask, what did I do today? And to remember that if I was able to speak into the life of someone else to influence them towards good, then what I'm doing really matters. And so I think for educators, that's just become a tag for me, is to remind people that what you do really matters. In fact, I say that at the end of every one of my podcasts. As I tag out, I'll say, and don't forget, what you do matters. And I've had more than one educator reach out to me and say, Will, when you say that at the end of the show, sometimes I get choked up because it's the first time in a long time someone has told me that what I do matters. So it's become something, Tyler, that I just love to remind people about.
And it's a great message to share. Two thoughts came to mind is when you said, I'm going to take you back to 2012, over 10 years ago. My head went, that was over 10 years ago. Holy cow. What has happened in the last 13 to what is it? Yeah, it would have been 13 years since we got there. And the second one is, it's a great message, but how does it show up for you and how do you use it within your workflow?
Yeah. Well, you're making me think about something that's important to me, which is, because now I spend most of my time with leaders reflecting on the challenges and the situations that they're managing and helping them think about next steps. I do a lot of teaching now. It's kind of fun to be a teacher again because I also cover a lot of content through my books, but also bringing in other content with leaders too. And so let me say two things. One, what I like to do is, like everybody else, I always have a list of to-dos throughout the day. But when I get toward the end of a day, one of the questions I like to ask myself is, what are the most important values, relationships, changes that I want to see in the lives of the people I'm trying to help? And have I actually moved the needle today in that direction? Have I moved the needle even just 1 degree? And if I don't feel satisfied that I have, then on my best days, I try to do something as I'm wrapping up that day to make sure I've moved that needle. When I was a high school principal, sometimes that meant that as I was wrapping up a hard day and maybe I was just beat up emotionally, or something really difficult had happened that I had to manage, if I asked myself that question, did I move the needle today? And if I felt like I hadn't, then I wouldn't leave my office until I had reached out to someone, picked up my phone, go found someone, or maybe even just sit down and composed an email. I'm just listing out some of the amazing achievements that I had seen kids or teachers accomplishing that day. But to share that out in some way, whether it's one-on-one or with a group, to make sure that we're pulled back to the purpose of why we're doing what we're doing. The second thing I'll say is that sometimes I just have to kind of have this moment of humility and tell myself what I call the two truths. And those two truths, the first one's going to sound unkind. The first truth is, I'm not as important as I think I am. Someday my school's going to exist without me. Someday kids are going to walk down the halls and maybe my picture will be on the wall and they'll say, who is that? But in the moment you think, man, I'm so important and this school could never survive without me. Well, someday it will. And so I have to remind myself the humility that I'm not as important as I think I am. But then the second truth is I'm more important than I think I am. And so are you, because every day when I step into a school, every moment that I'm with someone, I have the opportunity to encourage them, to inspire them, to help provide solutions for them, to support them in some way. And so if I'm present in that moment in a way that's going to make someone to become better in whatever they're doing, then that's an important truth to hold on to as well. So I just try to keep those truths in my mind, Tyler, as I'm working towards that purpose.
And after you shared the first one, I almost knew the second one was coming from there. Now, the whole time that you're talking, I'm trying to determine what that root value is in which we hold. And I'm hearing from your story about I had to do something to move the needle a little bit, and you instantly brought it to a connection with people. And so my head went to a value of relationships, but maybe help me hit the head on the nail here. And have you aligned what you're doing to 2 to 3 core values, core principles that you are driven by beyond the quote?
Well, I mean, I'll just be really vulnerable. I'm a person of faith. And so I believe that every person has dignity. Every person should be treated in a way that where you're holding them up to the value that they have. So Tyler, when I step into a room with kids or with adults or with other people, and maybe it's partly because of how I was raised. I was raised in a very rural, in some cases, poor community. I when I became a teacher and we were handing out forms for kids to sign up for free and reduced lunches or title programs and things like that, I realized one day the light bulb went off. I was always that kid. I mean, I was always qualifying for those things when I was a kid, but I didn't realize it was because I was poor. I just my parents filled out the form, and I always ended up getting this free reduced lunch option or additional tutoring. And it wasn't until I became an educator that I realized, man, I was that kid. But the teachers in my life, I was never aware from my parents or my teachers that I came from a struggling family or that that we needed additional help, because I grew up in a school where my teachers were probably the most highly educated people I knew. And yet they treated all of us like we could do anything. And they made us believe that we had potential. I'll never forget Rita Owen, my language arts teacher in 8th grade, who pulled me aside one day and she said, "Hey, Will, did you know you're a good writer?" And I was like, "No." And she was like, "I think next year when you start high school, you should consider the advanced English course because I really think you're ready." And little did she know that I was going to be an English teacher. So I didn't know that then, but she was inspiring me to really pursue something that she said I was good at. Little did she know I'd be publishing 4 books someday. She has since passed, and I just often regret the ability to tell her all the things I'm doing now. But I try to share her story every time I have an opportunity, because it's people like that who I think have driven me to do what I do. One day I was in the car. I've 4 children, and 2 of my daughters got to graduate from the school where I was principal. And one day I was in the car with my second daughter, Maddie, and I was just talking to her about how weird it is to have grown up the way that I did and now get to do the things that I'm doing. And I said, sometimes I have this paradox of like, how do I talk about my accomplishments without sounding like I'm bragging? And I love kids, because she said, "Well, Dad, that wouldn't be a problem if you give credit to the people who got you where you came from." And so I think that's part of my core value too, Tyler, is I feel like I've got to pay it forward because of how much people invested in me. I could not do what I'm doing today if it hadn't been for Rita Owen or Desmond Adams, my math teacher, who would pull me out of the lunchroom to correct my work so that I could be eligible to play basketball, or Charles Kate, our principal, who would come play basketball with us in the afternoons or do art with us in class, or Kenneth Humphrey, my choir teacher, who taught me to love music. And so those people invested in me, and so it's my turn to keep doing that for other people.
And it's becoming clear, evident at least, a value of relationships, a value of experience, a value of love, all related to working with other people to bring people up, which is an incredible story. And I very much appreciate that you are shouting out these people that have helped along the way, because I totally agree with what your daughter said. That is one of the best ways to do it without seeming like you're bragging about yourself, is give credit to all the people that have supported you along the way. Now, that's a very strong message. And the quote you gave is a very strong quote to bring to the table. Will, have you heard of an elevator pitch before?
Sure.
Okay, so the last part of our Grounded Moments segment is I want to give you a 10 to 20 second pitch of your idea to someone on the show, anybody listening, around why they need to focus on this. And we'll stick to the theme of what you do matters. And in your pitch, it's important to really sell them on the value of it. Are you ready?
Yes. You want me to give an elevator pitch of what you do matters? I'm ready.
And take it away whenever you're ready.
Listen, today you're going to have the opportunity to step into the lives of probably young people, or even colleagues, or maybe other educators. And here's the question I have for you. Is your influence and their presence going to make their lives better or make their lives harder? Because we all have the power to step into a room and to fill that room up with positivity, with potential, with creativity, with discovery. Or we had the opportunity to step in that room and suck the life out of it. So today, as you step into whatever room you're stepping into, just remember that what you do matters. And your influence is so important on whether or not someone in that room is going to walk out better or bitter based on being in your presence.
That was a great pitch, Will. And to bring up, I was trying to think of a transition here. Instead of saying we're going to suck the life out of people in the next segment, we are going to talk about adversity in the next segment, though, which brings us to our error element on headwinds and tailwinds. Through storms and surges, discover the lessons from headwinds and tailwinds, where we focus on the challenges that test us and the forces that help us move forward. And Will, you bet, we have a new segment here, which means we are playing a new game, a little different from principles and preferences. This game, speaking of sucking the life out of the room from people, this game is called Make It Worse. And so I'm going to read you a scenario, and in one line after it, Your job is to make the scenario even worse than what I just read.
Okay.
We won't get too dark. We'll try to keep it fun and lighthearted. We can have a little bit of conversation around what's going here. And I have summer themed it again because, again, we're coming out into summer. So are you ready to play this one?
Yeah. You're so fun, Tyler. Let's do it.
There we go. So we're going to make it worse. You show up to the beach and realize you forgot your swimsuit.
Make it worse? I guess you would go skinny dipping. That would definitely make it worse.
Or better, you never know. You still got to swim. You're halfway through a summer road trip and your car AC dies.
I'll make it worse. Am I supposed to make it worse? Is that what we're doing?
No, you don't have to keep saying it. We'll just add to it.
Make it worse. Sing while you're just miserably sweating to death.
And finally get to the cabin and the mosquitoes are already waiting.
Oh, make it worse. Sleep outside.
You host a backyard barbecue and it starts raining.
Cook on the grill anyway with wet burgers.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, a couple more here. You grab your floaties, your drink, and your shades, and the pool is closed.
Make it worse, sit in the kiddie pool instead.
So you go to the kiddie pool. Hey, that's maybe making light of the situation, though.
Maybe, yeah.
You're 5 minutes into a hike, and your only water bottle is leaking.
Oh, make it worse. You keep going and die of dehydration.
And last one here is you bring the speaker to the beach, and it dies right before the drop.
Make it worse. You play your radio loud from your car windows and annoy everyone else.
Everybody, you just get their reports. Okay. Well, there we go. That's how, I guess, the ultimate.
Did I play that right? That feels so
we
weird.
played that.
Okay,
We played that great,
right.
Making things worse. It was awesome. And it's a segue from the adversity that we could face in something fun like the summer to adversity that we actually face in our lives and our jobs. Well, I mean, some of the summer adversity we just shared is adversity that I've actually faced before.
Poor guy.
I definitely not barbecued in the rain. But that being said, I want to segue to the conversation on leadership here. And can you share a moment where you faced significant adversity or a difficult time?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. But I'll just stay with this theme of making it worse. Okay, I'm going to go way, way back when I was probably a second year as a new administrator, assistant principal. We had a situation where like the night before, a bunch of kids had broken into some lockers. They were in the school, in part of the school they shouldn't have been. And some stuff was stolen. So guess whose job it was to figure out who had gotten into the lockers and who had to be held accountable. And it was just, talk about a yucky day. Because you're spending your time pulling students in and having all these conversations, which means you don't get to go watch instruction. You don't get to be around the school seeing the great things that are happening. You don't get to do all the other things that are on your to-do list. You're just feeling like a police officer. And to make it worse, I was beginning to, as I pulled in students, get some sense of who all was involved because, kids, sometimes they tell on each other. So, so you're getting information from one and then another. But I had this young girl in my office and I was convinced based on all the other conversations I had that she was involved in this situation. She was adamant that she wasn't. And to make it worse, I just refused to budge. And so did she. And so she's sitting here crying. I decide to finally just have her wait out while I interview the next kid. And so and when the next kid comes in, I realize, and I don't remember all the scenarios, Tyler, but I just somehow the light bulb came on that this kid I'm talking to now was the girl that I thought I had mistaken the identities. And so as soon as I finished with this girl who was admitting guilt to the situation, I had to pull the other girl in and apologize and call her parents and just try to make the best of a really ugly situation where I had taken this girl who had not done something wrong and had accused her of doing something wrong. And it really taught me a lesson, which was from that point on, no matter how important it was for me to make sure kids were held accountable, was to not assume guilt and to make sure that students are treated in a way that even though, the role of an administrator sometimes to be the hammer, to make sure that I treated students in the way I would want to be treated if I was on the other side of me. And that was helpful for me moving forward. I still had to do all my responsibilities with discipline and making sure kids followed rules and holding students accountable. But man, I never wanted to go through that experience again.
Thank you for sharing and being vulnerable on it. It opens the door for a larger conversation around something that you actually said, which is you want to assume that people aren't guilty. But when you're in a school and somebody does something, or we think somebody does something, usually the kids around them and even the teachers and the parents tend to assume people are guilty and they want action right away before there's a due process of figuring out what actually happened and what's actually just and fair. Can you maybe take some time and walk me through how that moment and maybe moments prior, moments after have shaped how you navigate the dynamics of when an incident's brought forward, how people can address it in a way that shows it's important, but doesn't also empower people to just start getting in on kind of a pitchfork situation?
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say is the power of equanimity. I actually learned that word from my friend Jen Schwanke, who co-hosts my podcast with me. She's been a guest on your show, which is when other people are losing their minds, you've got to stay calm as a leader, which is just recognizing that in any situation, people can get all upset. Someone has to maintain the dignity of the moment and go, you know what? We need to investigate the situation. We're going to find out what happened. And if there's people that need to be held accountable, we'll follow through. But then you begin the process, which means that you have to have time to examine, time to ask questions, time to get feedback, time to look at all the evidence, and then do a lot of documentation, which for me means that I'm writing down things that I'm finding out. If I'm interviewing students, I'm getting information from them. Sometimes they're writing things down for me. A lot of times I'll just keep a notebook right in front of me because I'm just trying to make sure I'm writing down the details that I'm getting from students as well, so I have a clear picture of what's happening. And then based on that examination, if I'm convinced that this is a situation that requires accountability, then this is the part that's important to me too, is accountability should always be done with an eye for restoration, which means that I want to treat this student in the way that I would have wanted to be treated as a student, or that I would want my own child to be treated, which is that all of us make mistakes. All of us do things that need to be corrected, but the correction doesn't mean that I've lost my relationship with you. It doesn't mean that I can't ever trust you again. It means that you're human. And so we're going to employ whatever accountability measures need to happen here. But it doesn't change the fact that we still care about you. We're going to still support you. We're going to welcome, if it's a really bad situation, and sometimes students have to be removed when they return, we're going to welcome you back into this community in a way where we can rebuild trust. Those are just super important to me, Tyler, because I think that at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we are doing the due diligence in our work, that people recognize that there are consequences for bad choices, that people are held accountable in their choices. But if I'm going to err on the side of and this is the older Will. When I was younger, I would say I was a harder disciplinarian. And as I got older, I was still holding people very accountable, but I wanted to do it in a way where I could restore that relationship as quickly as possible too. I'm laughing because my own daughters would tell me, because they went to my school, that students would say, their friends would say to them, I never like to be called in your dad's office because he's so nice when I'm in trouble. So there's this weird paradox, which is like, I know I'm going to be held accountable, but I know I'm loved. And so I think that's an important mix to have.
That's a great way to do it. And there's a deeper message behind it on, when people are facing adversity, it's a very uncomfortable thing to be in a difficult moment, a challenging situation, navigate a hard conversation. And because of that, people like to rush and make quick decisions to try to get out of that situation as fast as they can to return to places of comfort. And usually the result of that is either you're putting a Band-Aid over a problem that's going to resurface, or you're creating a new problem by rushing to get out of it. And so the message I'm hearing from you on this is, by saying, I want to do this justice, I want to take time to sort it out properly, gather thoughts, you're buying time to make sure that you understand all of the adversity in its fullest form so that it can be addressed in the correct way once, instead of having to be addressed or recovered from 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And Will, with that message, for people facing their own headwinds, is there any advice you would give to help them move forward on top of this, despite the storm they might be facing?
Yeah. So what I hear you asking me, Tyler, is if people are facing headwinds, what other advice would I give them as they're thinking about moving forward? This may not be the answer people would want to hear, but it's helped me. And I call it the power of switching your focus. So let me explain what I mean by that. It is inevitable that in the work as educators, especially in leadership too, that you're going to be facing really hard adversities every day. I mean, the list of them can sometimes seem insurmountable. But if the lens through which I'm viewing my school when I step in every day is, how am I going to manage all of this adversity? then my mindset ends up being I'm a problem manager. So what really has helped me is when I step into a day is to realize the lens through which I have to look through my day is what are the problems that I can help solve, but what are some other situations where I might make things better? Or what are some ways that I can be also experiencing the celebration and the achievement of students? Because I want to experience the good, not just the challenge of this day. So knowing that means when I'm walking in, I'm actually looking for good too. I'm not just looking for challenge. So that when I do face an adversity, I'm going to try to manage it. I'm going to try to reconcile it. But then I'm going to try to immediately switch my focus over to, okay, now where can I go see achievement happening? Where can I reconnect with the great things that are happening in this school that make me want to be here? What were the other 95% of the student population doing today that's worth celebrating while I manage the 5% that we're not doing what they should have been doing? And so I grabbed that word switch your focus from, I was watching a Winter Olympics cross country skiing competition one time. And I saw at the beginning of the race, and I'm forgetting his name, but there was a Olympic skier. He crashed right at the beginning of the race, and all these people stumbled over him. And I thought, poor guy, he's out. And then cross country skiing lasts forever. Like an hour later, I come back and he's at the front of the race. In fact, he gets the gold medal. And so when they're interviewing him after, they ask him, "How did you do that? You fell, and then you ended up winning." And he said, "I switched my focus. I was laying there in the snow, and I was like, well, I got to figure out how do I get back up front again instead of sitting here in the snow." And I don't know why I just held on to that term. I was like, I want to do that. I want to switch my focus when something knocks me down, and I'm having a really hard day. How can I switch my focus back to getting up front and figuring out how we can win together today? So that's something that helps me.
And it's actually a deeper message because on a psychological level, it's kind of been proven that we're not multitaskers. We can't do multiple things at the same time. We're switch taskers, and some people are really good switch taskers and can take on many tasks that they switch between in a given moment. But when we switch too fast, too many, that's again where we find that adversity. And so to share the story about switching focus, it made me think about the idea of switch tasking and how when you multitask, you kind of don't do everything justice, but if you can switch tasks to one thing at a time and put your focus into it, the result out of it can become much more significant, much more powerful, and definitely matter. Now, with that, we're talking about the changes that we do when we're faced with adversity to then take action. And that's going to bring us to our water element on ripples of change. Small shifts, big waves. This is Ripples of Change, where we dive into the power of embracing change and making waves that last. And we're going to play another game
in your class, Tyler. This is so fun, man.
I try to make things as exciting as possible. This is new to the show. And so at the time of recording this, I think I started on episode 55 where we did these little segues, these games, and I just wanted to find a way to bring some liveliness to the show a little bit. And so I love the feedback. Thank you from a guest experience. You know what, though? That's a good point. From a listener experience, reach out, Tyler at elementaleducator.com. Do you like the segues? Do you like the games? Are they working for you? Would you like to see something different? Because you bet that we are moving into another game here. And this one is called Here's the Trick. So it's a bit more of an expanded version. I'm only going to give you 3 to 5 kind of topics here. And your job is to give a piece of advice for this situation that actually works, or maybe it's something you've done or you've heard somebody do. And we're going to summer theme it again. Are you ready to give it a try?
I think I understand this. So I'm supposed to give advice on what to do next?
Yeah, give some advice on the situation.
Having fun here, right?
Yeah, we're just having fun.
Okay, here we go.
All right, so let's start with if you want to avoid tan lines. The trick is
never take off your clothes.
Then you get the farmer's tan unless you're going full suit or, maybe just a head tan. I don't know. Okay. If the best way to enjoy a road trip playlist is.
Let your kids choose it.
Let your kids choose it. Hey, okay. I'm probably going to be listening to the Frozen soundtrack for 4 hours if we do it that way. Although she is switching up the variety in the Disney characters, and so we might get a couple other ones in there. Okay, if you want to win at lawn games, always remember to.
Is this an adult audience? Don't drink too much.
See, I was going to say practice when no one's watching, but that always works too. So I remember I was so bad at ladder golf one year that I just played it forever. And eventually I got okay. But then obviously winter happens and next summer comes and you realize you're bad at ladder golf again. And I wasn't willing to start the process.
Never played ladder golf. I'm writing it down.
It's like, have you heard of it though?
No.
So it's, God, everybody that's played it is just going to judge me on my explanation. But it's essentially a rung, and it's got 3 rungs, and the bottom rung is worth 3 points, the middle rung is worth 2 points, and the top rung is worth 1 point. And you throw 2 golf balls that are connected by a string, so it's kind of like a bolo, and whatever rung it gets on is how many points you get. And you play to like 10 points. It's kind of a fun, maybe 21 points. It's a fun little thing, unless if you're not paying attention, golf balls hurt. So don't get hit by one.
I'm going to be looking that up.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet. Talking about making things better through change or what to do to address situations. What's a recent change, Will, that you have had to embrace or lead?
Well, I lead my own company now. And one of the things that's been really helpful for me, Tyler, is figuring out what are the things that I had found myself doing over and over again that were keeping me from doing the things that only I can do. So I'll just give you a really practical example. And this actually started a couple of years back, but it has now turned into a much more permanent situation. But a couple of years ago with my own podcast, I just realized, man, I'm spending so much time editing, writing notes, doing all these things that it's stress. It's a stress that I had just lived with for years because I've got, more than 400 episodes. So for me, I always would drop my podcast on Wednesdays. So that meant that Tuesdays, man, I was just like sometimes staying up really late just to make sure everything was ready to go. But I often, when I'm with leaders, I lead them through this practice of what are some things you're doing that you want to be doing that you don't want to be doing. What are some things that you wish you were doing, but you're not? What are some things you stopped doing? And I would do this practice with them too. And when I would always write it down, like editing my podcast. It's so tiring. So finally I reached my oldest daughter, was in college at the time. And I asked her, would you be interested in working part-time, just learning how to edit my show? And she was like, okay. So she did. And so she started doing that for me. And wow, suddenly I had like extra time. But then when I started this business full-time, I realized there was a lot of other little to-dos that were taking up time, whether that's follow-ups or invoicing or posting things or website updates and all these things. So last year I was able to invite her to join my team full-time. And so Emily is my full-time assistant. And I've been able to really streamline and train her to do some of those things that I was doing that are important, but were keeping me from doing other things that were more creative or giving me opportunity to sit and coach someone or to do an additional training. So I hope that answered your question, but it's just something.
That's awesome. Yeah. And a good change, and what a fun change to bring family into it and to continue that connection and that partnership. I mean, as long as she does good editing, it's not an issue. So, and you know what, I'm confident that she does if you're willing to share it on the show. But that's exactly right. Is whenever there is something, and the steps that you kind of shared, what is bringing you down, what is taking your energy, what is going against you moving the needle, and then you actively sought solutions to address those, right? And that's a big part of what consultants do. That's a big part of what teachers do, and that's a big part of what principals do. Is their job is to help things flow smoothly. And to do that, we have to identify where mistakes are happening and learn from them, right? Because mistakes shouldn't be something that are just shunned and never talked about. They should be things that are analyzed and determined what's the next best step to do the right thing to move forward. And it sounds like you found that in your workflow, which is awesome. And so congratulations for having that figured out and for supporting other people through figuring that out too. With implementing change, it often comes down to 2 key moments, which is that first step you take and the final move to make it stick. In starting your own business, what was the first move you took to really kick things off the ground?
It started the same year that I was recognized as Oklahoma's Assistant Principal of the Year. I was reading a book by Michael Hyatt called Platform, Getting Noticed in a Noisy World, because I, at the time, and I mentioned this earlier in our conversation, was trying to figure out how do I marry this passion that I have for school leadership, but also this I love to write, and I was not doing both at the same time. And so, I also loved I started getting invitations to speak to aspiring leaders or to young leaders. And I really enjoyed those opportunities. And I was like, how can I do more of that? And so I was reading this book by Michael Hyatt, who himself had been the former CEO of Thomas Nelson Publishing, but he was also a really avid blogger, and he had been able to kind of launch his own business. And I was just looking at his models, and I was like, how did this guy become a content creator? What does that take? And in the book, he was explaining his commitment to sharing the things he was learning along the way by just writing them down and just recording them. And he said something, Tyler, that stuck with me. He said that in his work as a content creator, but also working with others, a lot of people would get excited about the possibility of doing something like that and commit to it for a year. But because they didn't see the returns they wanted, they would just usually fizzle out. Some would commit to it for 2 years, maybe 3 years. But the same thing, after a while, they get tired, so they just kind of give up. But he said the people that he saw that usually turned the corner or saw that momentum grow into something that was worth the time were people that would do it for at least 5 years. It would become a consistent commitment, a craft that they would just do over time. Because when you commit to something consistently over time, you just automatically get better at it and you begin to learn from it. And so, man, I just made a commitment. When I was reading that book, I was just like, okay, every week I'm going to create some kind of content, whether it's just 500 words, 800 words, 1,000 words, just something I can share that I'm learning. And I'm going to do it every week for the next 5 years. And I'm just going to see what happens. And so that commitment to that first step for me was just a commitment to consistency, and without any guarantee of what was going to happen on the other end. But that commitment to consistency then gave me the opportunity to then grow its impact. So that's what was helpful for me to get started.
And I think I know where this next question's going, but people often worry that change like the one you're talking about won't last. And one of the comments that we talked about earlier was we don't matter as much as we think we do, but then we also matter as much as we think we do. And when we leave a position or we leave a situation or we leave something, then it's still going to flow and it's still going to run without us. That's what places do. But what's one thing that you do and that you can encourage other people to do to make the changes that they're trying to do become a part of that culture rather than just the trend that goes with you?
Well, that's a really important question. If you're part of an organization or a school, you want to make sure that the culture that you're building is a shared experience. So I'm just going to get really granular and for someone that's working within a school setting. And that is that if you're building a culture that you want everyone to be able to buy into, then you better not be having those conversations in your own head. And so you have to be intentional, Tyler, to involve as many people as possible in the process of building that shared identity. So I'll just be really practical when I'm talking to leaders who are trying to figure out the big question, or there's something going on where they want to grow, or they want to see their school transition to something newer or better. I'm just going to ask them, okay, show me intentionally who you're inviting into these conversations with you to help shape the answer that you're looking for. When are you meeting with your teachers to ask these questions that you're wrestling with? When are you meeting with student leaders to ask these questions that you're meeting with? When are you meeting with your fellow leaders that maybe are kind of your core group of folks that you would rely on to help guide your school? When are you meeting with your community members to have these conversations? Because a culture is a shared experience. I'll give you an example. Every year, our student leaders would gather in the summer, and we let them come up with the motto for the year. It wasn't something we came up with. We let them come up with a motto for the year. And they would usually rally around something that would just kind of give them a tag to hold on to. So I led a school that was north of Tulsa, Oklahoma called Skiatook, which is in a small town. And one year they wanted hashtag Skiatook Strong. Everything we do represents strength. And so that meant that I adopted that, our teachers adopted that, our announcements every single day, every newsletter we put out for that whole year, everything we did on social media, it had hashtag Skiatook Strong, because that's what the kids wanted for their identity to be that year. And the next year, the student leaders chose a different hashtag. So I know that may not be what the answer you're looking for, but I just think that those kinds of movements and that kind of culture building has to happen collectively.
And when it's a good idea, it will stick.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's not always true because sometimes really good ideas fall through the cracks. When it's a good idea pushed in the right direction, it can stick. And most of the good ideas aren't connected to names. And so my thoughts on that question when I ask it are, if I'm trying to implement a change, it's a change that anybody should be able to do, and it's not just me. And that's how we're going to get it to stick as well, which is what you're sharing. You're centering it around the people that are in the building at the time. Because when you say we're going to create a motto, well, some schools have mottos that have been around for 30 years and nobody in the building was a part of creating it, but it's the motto that they're going to use. So it makes sense to revisit it and actively work with it every single year because you're working with the new people in your building in that moment at that time. And it creates this idea of ownership and investment into where they are. And when you have ownership and investment into where you are, you have increased engagement where you are. And again, this is like a big spiral. Increased engagement means you're higher behaviorally engaged, you're higher emotionally engaged. So now you can be higher cognitively engaged and you can get to some really powerful content. The only pushback I would give on that, Will, is you said it was granular to education, but this is actually a statement that's very true to beyond education. And you're talking about the theme of transparency and how people in management leadership, we need to bring a bit more transparency. Now, that doesn't mean totally openness and share your books and share everything with everybody in your organization, but you need to invite people to be a part of the conversation to, again, create everything we've just talked about: meaningful change, meaningful ownership, meaningful engagement in those situations. And that can be a scary thing. It can be a big moment. It can be a bold decision, which is going to bring us to our fire element, our last segment on spark or burn. Ignite your ideas, face the flames. This is Spark or Burn, where we talk about bold decisions, big risks, and the fires that either spark success or burn lessons into our memory. And we are going to end off our last elemental segment here, Will, with one more game. This game is called Final Answer. So much like principle or preference, I'm going to give you a this or that situation. You just have to pick one of them, but there's no time to justify the choice, okay? Okay, one choice, no regrets. Let's lock it in. Beach day or pool day?
Beach day.
Hot weather all summer or cool nights all summer?
Cool nights all summer.
Only eating barbecue for a month or only eating popsicles for a month?
A barbecue.
Music festival weekend or cabin in the woods weekend?
Cabin in the woods.
Lose power during a heat wave or get stuck in a traffic jam with no AC?
Lose power in a heat wave. I don't know.
Travel with friends? Travel with friends or travel solo?
Travel with friends.
Summer with no internet or summer with no sunglasses?
Ooh. Summer with no sunglasses. I'll be real. I want that internet.
Fireworks at midnight or sunrise paddleboard?
I love fireworks at midnight.
And camping under the stars or staying in a luxury beach resort?
Give me those stars.
Yeah, there we go. And speaking of bold decisions that we just made here, can you tell me a time here, Will, where you had to make a bold leadership decision or took a major risk? And what was the spark behind it that made you say, I have to go for this?
All right. I'm going to talk about the risk that it took for me to do what I'm doing right now, Tyler, because, going from a career in K-12 education to full-time consulting and coaching and being an author it's not easy. But after I had become a principal, I was a leader in my state principals association, and we did a lot of training with leaders. And a friend of mine, Glenn Absher, I'll give him a quick shout out. He's the executive director of the Oklahoma Elementary Education Association. We used to do a shared training around helping leaders become better coaches. And one day we were doing this coaching scenario where we asked teams to get into groups of 3, and one team was missing a third member. So I just sat down so they would have a third member, and they were each practicing coaching questions around the 3. And each person was to share a current challenge that they were facing. And we asked people to be vulnerable and transparent. So these other 2 were sharing some real challenges that they were currently facing. And then it was my turn. And I was like, I've got to share something real. I can't just make it up. And the real challenge that I had actually been wrestling with that week was whether or not I should consider at some point transitioning out of the very position I was in right then to doing this kind of work full time. And I was wrestling with, should I say this to them? Because they're like in my organization and this is just so vulnerable. But I took the risk and I said, I'm going to share something with you that I've been wrestling with. And as we were going through that coaching cycle, one of the leaders on the other side of me asked me this question. I'll never forget it. She said, Will, I know what you currently do, and I know what you're thinking about doing. Where do you think you would make the most impact in the lives of leaders if you had to choose between these two? And I knew right then, I knew that I would actually make a greater impact if I transitioned into this work, because it was going to take me way beyond where I worked in Oklahoma. And I knew the relationships I'd already developed with leaders in other states. I knew other organizations that were asking more of me. And I knew right then, this is the direction I have to go. So I took that risk to put myself in that vulnerable situation. But that question really became the guiding question that helped me to make that decision. And it's what's happening. I work with, gosh, right now I probably have 120 leaders that are in cycles with me, just going through coaching and work. And they're in Ohio, they're in Kentucky, they're in Texas, they're in California. I've been in Louisiana this year, and North Carolina. I've just been all over the place working with leaders. So not just here in my own state, but across the spectrum of places that I've been able to influence. So it's humbling, but it also is just a good reminder that sometimes we just need to be willing to ask ourselves that hard question, and then ask ourselves, am I willing to take the risk that it might take to make that kind of impact?
And your story here resonates really deeply with me, because when I was a tennis coach after just graduating high school, it was all about the impact I could have on athletes. And when I segued into education, it was all around the impact I could have on the future of where we are as a society, as a world. And that's what steered me to do what I'm doing now. Is it's all centered around that same word of what is the impact we can make and what impact can we have. And that's kind of the creation of this Elemental Educator platform. Was I wanted to create a space of impact, hopefully in leadership, hopefully in education, around that. And so I really appreciate you sharing that story, because it's a powerful story that I'm finding a lot of similarities to. And with this, these bold decisions, leaving a stable job to take on what you're doing right now, it can be intimidating. Do you have any advice for the listeners on how they could navigate making bold decisions for themselves?
All right. Well, I'm just going to give a shameless plug for my newest book, because I wrote an entire book about this, Tyler, and I have it with me. It's called Whose Permission Are You Waiting For? An Educator's Guide to Doing What You Love, because that is the question for the last 3 years, especially when I'm working with leaders and they're trying to figure out, well, what should I consider when I'm looking at my own pathways and the opportunities in front of me? And that question I've to answer that question requires a lot of reflection with the person who's asking it. And so just to give you one thing to keep in mind, what's been helpful for me is to realize that most of the time when we're looking at pathways in front of us, the choice isn't binary. Even though in that decision that I was making about where am I going to make the most impact, because I was looking between these two options, in my own thinking and brainstorming, I gave myself permission to consider multiple options. And so one of the things that I like to encourage leaders to consider is what I call pathway thinking, where instead of just like putting yourself in a position where you're constantly trying to choose between A and B and pros and cons, is give yourself permission to create 2 or 3 or even 4 potential pathways that could take you the places that your passions and your talents and your gifts and your values and open doors might be giving you. Exploring those, investigating those, letting curiosity drive you down each pathway, finding people on those different pathways that could inform you and give you some feedback as to potentials that could exist there, testing those pathways to see if maybe some of them have more opportunities than others. And then based on that exploration, then wisely deciding what's that next step. And so there's a chapter in my book where I talk about that important idea of pathway thinking. It's just one way that's been really helpful for me, for myself, but also in coaching leaders and just thinking about the variables involved in hard decisions.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Will. And I have to ask at this point, where can people find your books if they want to purchase them?
Well, they're easy to find on my website. If you go to it's my name, williamdparker.com/books, you'll see a copy of all 4 of my books there. And Whose Permission Are You Waiting For is right at the top of the page.
And williamdparker.com will be in the show notes, by the way, audience. And so even just connecting with Will, following up on the conversation, that's where you're going to be able to find and get a hold of him. Now, that kind of concludes our elemental segments. My last segment here, I still don't have a segue intro for, and it's been 8-9 episodes since then, so I'm just rolling with it. We're moving on to listener questions, Will. And so I put on my social media, hey, I have a guest coming on the show. What questions might you have for us? And so I'm just going to pull out my phone. It's usually just on my Instagram feed, and I'm going to go to my stories, and I'm just going to check if we have a reply here today. And I think we had one when I checked this morning before we got started. We do. And it's quite straightforward. They said, what advice would you give to new leaders?
Oh, to new leaders. I ask the same question on my podcast to people all the time. So now this is fun being on the other side of it. For a new leader, I would say give yourself permission to build relationships before you start trying to change systems. So, and when I mean build relationships, I mean, and I know every school has a different setting, a different population, a different size. I've worked in large schools, I've worked in smaller schools. But as a leader, one of my first commitments, especially as a new leader, was just to get to know everyone, which means everyone. I'm going to get to know the custodians by name. I'm going to get to know the bus drivers by name. I'm going to stand in line and meet all the ladies and people that work within the cafeteria. I'm going to spend time with my security personnel. I'm going to know every teacher and try to figure out the names of their families and their kids. I'm going to stand at the door and greet students and meet them. I'm going to spend as much time with people as I can building relationships, because even though you know who you are as a person, and hopefully you trust the decisions you're making are in the best interest of others, other people don't know you. And so they need to learn to trust you too. And I have always worked by this equation that keeps things really simple for me, Tyler, which is time spent equals relationships built. So the more time you can spend with people, the more relationships you're going to build with them. And then that gives you permission. If you start seeing things that need to be changed or systems that need to be improved, it gives you a trusting environment in which to do it.
That's right. Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing, Will. Alchemists, as we start to, well, actually, I should answer this question too, because normally when a question comes in, I let my guest answer and then I give my take on it. And I feel like I'm beating on the same drum here again when I come back and share this point, which is the first leadership quality standard that Alberta leaders and teachers and superintendents are held to is effective relationships. We're asked every year, make your professional growth plan and pick a competency or pick a couple competencies and focus on these competencies. And as a first year leader, a new leader, focus on that competency, focus on the effective relationships, focus on building all of the connections that Will just shared. And the ability to do that, you'll see your decisions become easier, your day-to-day workflow become easier, because you're creating a space where people want to be, not where people have to be. And there's a big importance between those two lines of a want and a have, or a need and a want, right? There's so many debates around, even from a budget standpoint at home. Do we need this or do we want this? Create a split space where people want it, not where they need it. That would be my advice to them. And as we wrap up our episode, Alchemists, I just want to thank you for taking the time to sit down wherever you are. Maybe you're on the road, maybe you're at your desk and it's on in the background, and listening to our episode today with William D. Parker. Again, check our show notes for the link to his website, link to his books, a link to more information and how to connect with him. This show exists to hopefully bring some meaningful impact to you, help you move the needle as well. And if that did happen today, reach out to Tyler at elementaleducator.com and let me know how this helped you today. And Will, thank you so much for taking time out of your morning to sit down and have a great conversation.
This was my pleasure, Tyler. Kudos to you for an amazing podcast.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to The Elemental Educator. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, find us on Instagram, Facebook, and X at Elemental Educator.